November 1956, London. The Bank of England is bleeding, not from bombs, but from a phone call. President Eisenhower has just informed the British government that the United States will not support the pound sterling. Britain's reserves are collapsing. Within hours, Prime Minister Anthony Eden will be forced into the most humiliating retreat in modern British history, abandoning the Suez Canal. The world watched as the greatest empire in history discovered a brutal truth. When your creditor turns against you, your military means nothing. Your history means nothing. Your pride means nothing. That was 1956. Today, America owes China over $800 billion, and China has started selling. Not in panic, not in haste, methodically, quietly, strategically. The question is not whether America will face its Suez moment. The question is, has it already begun? And no one told you. July 1944. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. In a grand hotel nestled in the White Mountains, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered to rebuild the world. Europe was still burning. The Pacific was soaked in blood. And yet, in this quiet American resort, the future of global finance was being decided. The agreement they signed would change everything. The United States dollar would become the anchor of the international monetary system. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. And the dollar, crucially, would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. America made a promise to the world. Our currency is as good as gold. For the first time in history, a single nation's paper money became the foundation of global trade. The British pound, which had dominated for over a century, was quietly dethroned. The American century had officially begun, but there was a catch. To maintain this system, America had to remain disciplined. It had to hold enough gold to back the dollars circulating around the world. It had to run balanced budgets. It had to be the responsible anchor. For 25 years, it worked. Then came Vietnam, the Great Society programs, the guns and butter economy. America began spending more than it earned. Dollars flooded overseas, and foreign governments, particularly France, started asking an uncomfortable question. If you have so many dollars out there, do you actually have the gold to back them? They knew the answer, and they started demanding their gold. August 15th, 1971, the Nixon shock. President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. Temporary. That was the word he used. It has now been 54 years. The suspension never ended. In a single broadcast, America broke its promise to the world. The dollar was no longer backed by anything except faith. Faith in the US government. Faith in the US economy. Faith in the US military. Economists call this the fiat system. From the Latin, let it be done. Money by decree. Money by declaration. Money backed by nothing but trust. What happened next would have seemed impossible to the men at Bretton Woods. America began borrowing without limits. The national debt, which had taken 200 years to reach $400 billion by 1971, exploded. $1 trillion by 1982, $5 trillion by 1986, $10 trillion by 2008. Today, it exceeds $34 trillion. And the world kept lending. Why? Because there was no alternative. The dollar was the language of global trade. Oil was priced in dollars. Commodities were priced in dollars. If you wanted to participate in the world economy, you needed dollars. And if you accumulated dollars, the safest place to store them was in US Treasury bonds. America had discovered something intoxicating, the ability to consume without producing, to borrow without consequences, to print the very currency the world needed. French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it the exorbitant privilege. But privilege has a price. History teaches a brutal lesson about nations that borrow beyond their means. Spain, in its golden age, controlled the largest empire the world had ever seen. Silver flooded in from the Americas. And yet between 1557 and 1596, the Spanish crown defaulted on its debts 4 times. 4 times in 40 years. The most powerful nation on earth, bankrupted by its own arrogance. Spain never recovered. The patterns are always the same. First, the borrowing feels free, then it becomes necessary, then it becomes desperate, and finally, the creditors lose faith. By 2000, America's largest creditor was no longer Europe. It was no longer Japan, it was China, a communist nation, a strategic rival, a country that remembered with bitter clarity what Western powers had done to it during the century of humiliation. And yet China kept buying American debt. Hundreds of billions, then over $1 trillion. Why would your greatest competitor fund your lifestyle? The answer to that question would take decades to reveal itself. January 1st, 1994. Beijing. While Americans celebrated the new year, Chinese officials quietly executed one of the most consequential financial maneuvers of the 20th century. The People's Bank of China devalued the yuan by 33% and pegged it to the US dollar. To Western economists, it seemed like a desperate move from a developing nation. China's GDP per capita was lower than Bolivia's. Its factories were primitive. Its financial system was opaque and unreliable. But this was not desperation. This was strategy. The men who ruled China in 1994 had not forgotten history. They remembered the Opium Wars, when British gunboats forced China to open its markets at cannon point. They remembered the century of humiliation, when Western powers carved up Chinese territory like a carcass. They remembered what happens when you are weak and your enemies are strong. They would never be weak again. The plan was elegant in its patience. By pegging the yuan to the dollar at an artificially low rate, Chinese exports became impossibly cheap. American corporations, hungry for profit, began relocating their factories to China. Walmart filled its shelves with Chinese goods. Apple built its empire on Chinese labor. And as dollars flooded into China, Beijing faced a choice. What do you do with hundreds of billions of American dollars? You could convert them to yuan, but that would strengthen your currency and destroy your export advantage. You could buy European assets, but Europe was stagnant. You could buy gold, but the quantities needed would destabilize global markets. Or you could do what Britain once did to a young, ambitious America. You could buy their debt. In the 19th century, British investors funded America's railroads, America's factories, America's westward expansion. British capital built the infrastructure of American power, and for decades Britain collected the interest, watching its former colony grow stronger with every passing year. The British believed they were profiting from American growth. They did not realize they were financing their own replacement. China understood this history better than America did. By 2000, China held $60 billion in US Treasury bonds. By 2005, that number had tripled. By 2008, China's holdings exceeded $1 trillion. The relationship appeared mutually beneficial. America received cheap goods and cheap loans. China received jobs, technology, and foreign currency reserves. Economists called it chimerica, a symbiotic fusion of the two largest economies on Earth. But symbiosis was never the goal. Japan had walked this path before, and China studied that failure carefully. In the 1980s, Japan was America's greatest economic rival. Japanese companies bought Rockefeller Center. They bought Columbia Pictures. Magazine covers asked, "Is America for sale?" Then came the Plaza Accord of 1985. Under American pressure, Japan agreed to strengthen the yen. The consequences were catastrophic. Japanese exports collapsed. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates to compensate, inflating a massive asset bubble. When that bubble burst in 1991, Japan entered a deflationary spiral that lasted decades. The lost decade. Then the lost score. Japan never challenged American dominance again. China's leaders looked at Japan and saw a warning. Never let the Americans dictate your currency policy. So China kept the yuan weak. It kept buying American debt. It kept its intentions hidden behind the language of partnership and cooperation. But what was China actually buying? Not just bonds, not just interest payments. Leverage. Every treasury bond China purchased was a thread in a web that grew larger every year. A web that gave Beijing something it had never possessed in modern history, the ability to inflict economic pain on the world's superpower. The Americans did not see it. They saw a communist nation recycling trade surpluses into safe assets. They saw a developing country with no alternative but to trust the dollar. They did not see a patient adversary, building position, waiting for the moment when the balance of power would shift. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. In September 2008, an investment bank named Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. And everything changed. September 15th, 2008, Beijing, 3:47 a.m. While most of China slept, officials at the People's Bank of China were wide awake, watching American financial markets disintegrate in real time. Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank in the United States, had just filed for bankruptcy. $639 billion in assets, gone. The largest corporate failure in American history. Within hours, panic spread across the globe. Stock markets collapsed. Credit markets froze. The American financial system, the foundation upon which China had parked over $1 trillion, was teetering on the edge of oblivion. In Washington, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson scrambled to contain the damage. The Federal Reserve prepared emergency measures that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks earlier. Quantitative easing. The phrase sounded technical, sterile. What it meant was simpler. The Federal Reserve would create money out of nothing and use it to buy toxic assets from failing banks. Between 2008 and 2014, the Fed conjured approximately $4 trillion into existence. $4 trillion that did not exist before. $4 trillion added to a money supply that China had trusted with its national savings. In Beijing, officials watched this spectacle with a mixture of alarm and clarity. The alarm was obvious. Their largest asset was being diluted before their eyes. But the clarity was more important. The Americans will always choose to print. When faced with a choice between fiscal discipline and monetary creation, between short-term pain and long-term stability, the United States would always choose the printing press. Always. China had just learned something invaluable about its debtor. On March 23, 2009, Zhou Xiaochuan, the governor of the People's Bank of China, published an essay that received little attention in the Western press. Its title was dry, academic, Reform the International Monetary System. But its message was revolutionary. Zhou argued that the world needed a new reserve currency, one not controlled by any single nation. He pointed to the inherent conflict of interest. How could the United States manage the global reserve currency responsibly when it was also tempted to abuse that privilege for domestic purposes? He was too diplomatic to say what he meant directly. So let us say it clearly. China had just declared, in the politest possible language, that it no longer trusted the dollar. This was not the first time a creditor had lost faith in American monetary policy. In 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle stood before cameras and denounced the dollar's exorbitant privilege. France began converting its dollar reserves into gold, physical gold, shipped across the Atlantic. Other nations followed. The drain on American gold reserves became so severe that 6 years later, Nixon was forced to abandon the gold standard entirely. De Gaulle saw the future before anyone else. He understood that a currency backed by nothing but faith would eventually betray that faith. Zhou Xiaochuan was China's de Gaulle. But there was a critical difference. When de Gaulle demanded gold, France had alternatives. Europe was rebuilding. The European Economic Community was growing. France could diversify. In 2009, China had no such options. The euro was untested. Gold markets were too small. There was no alternative infrastructure for global trade, so China did something more dangerous than demanding gold. It began building an alternative system, quietly, patiently, beneath the surface of official cooperation and diplomatic smiles. The first step, accumulate gold on a scale the world had never seen. There is a vault beneath the streets of London that tells the story of every empire. The Bank of England's gold vault, one of the largest in the world, has witnessed the rise and fall of nations, not through war, not through conquest, but through the silent movement of metal from one nation's pile to another. Gold does not lie. Gold does not spin narratives. Gold simply moves, away from the weak toward the strong. Between 1914 and 1945, gold flowed in one direction, out of Europe into America. 2 world wars drained the old powers of their reserves. Britain, France, Germany. They paid for American weapons, American food, American machinery, with the only currency that mattered when trust collapsed. By 1945, the United States held 70% of the world's monetary gold. That concentration of wealth was not an accident. It was the physical manifestation of a new world order. Now gold is moving again. The destination is different. The pattern is the same. Since 2009, China has been accumulating gold with an intensity that defies official statistics. The People's Bank of China reports its reserves sporadically. Years of silence, then sudden announcements of massive increases. In 2015, after a 6-year gap, Beijing revealed it had added 604 tons. Analysts were stunned. The actual number, many believe, was far higher. Why the secrecy? Because announcing gold purchases in real time would drive up prices, making each subsequent purchase more expensive. China learned from the mistakes of others. In 2013, Germany, America's closest European ally, requested the repatriation of its gold reserves held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. A simple request between allies. The gold belonged to Germany. Germany wanted it back. The Federal Reserve said it would take 7 years. 7 years to return gold that was supposedly sitting in a vault. The explanation was logistical complexity. The suspicion was something else entirely. The gold had been leased, lent, or leveraged into a web of obligations that could not be quickly unwound. Germany's request sent a signal to Beijing. If the Americans delay returning gold to their allies, what would they do to an adversary? China chose not to find out. Instead of storing gold in Western vaults, China built its own infrastructure. The Shanghai Gold Exchange, established in 2002, has become the largest physical gold exchange on Earth. Unlike Western exchanges, and where gold is traded as paper contracts, often without physical delivery, Shanghai deals in real metal. Physical bars, actual possession. The numbers are staggering. Between 2009 and 2023, more than 25,000 tons of gold flowed through the Shanghai Exchange. To put that in perspective, that is more than all the gold held by the United States, Germany, Italy, and France combined. Where did it go? Into Chinese vaults, into Chinese banks, into the hands of Chinese citizens, encouraged by their government to buy gold as a patriotic duty. The official figure for China's gold reserve stands at approximately 2,200 tons. Independent analysts, tracking mining output, import data, and refinery flows, estimate the true figure could be 3 to 4 times higher. 8,000 tons, perhaps more. Why would a nation accumulate gold in secret while publicly holding over $1 trillion in American debt? The answer is preparation. Gold is the asset you hold when you no longer trust the system. It is the anchor for a new currency. It is the foundation for a new financial order. China was not just hedging against risk, China was preparing for a world after the dollar. And in 2015, the next phase began, the dumping. History does not record the exact moment a creditor decides to leave. It only records the consequences. In 1989, Western banks began quietly reducing their exposure to Soviet debt. There were no announcements, no press conferences, just a steady, methodical withdrawal of capital from a system they no longer believed would survive. 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. The creditors always know first. China's exit from American debt follows a pattern so consistent, so methodical, that it can be mapped in 7 distinct stages. Each stage builds on the last. Each stage is harder to reverse. And by the time the public notices, the final stages are already underway. Stage 1, quiet reduction, 2015-2017. Peak holdings, $1.27 trillion in November 2013. Then silence, no dramatic sales, no public statements, just a slow, steady decline. $50 billion here, $30 billion there, enough to reduce exposure without triggering market panic. By 2017, holdings had dropped below $1.2 trillion. The financial press barely noticed. Stage 2, diversification, 2017 to 2019. The money had to go somewhere. China began redirecting capital into European bonds, African infrastructure projects, Belt and Road investments, and strategic commodities, copper mines in Congo, ports in Pakistan, railways across Central Asia. Each investment served dual purposes, economic return and geopolitical influence. The dollar was being replaced, not just as a reserve asset, but as a tool of power. Stage 3. Public warnings. 2018-2020. Chinese officials began saying publicly what they had believed privately for a decade. State media questioned dollar dominance. Academics published papers on de-dollarization. The message was calibrated, firm enough to signal intent, diplomatic enough to maintain deniability. We are not attacking the dollar. We are simply diversifying. Stage 4. Accelerated selling. 2022-2023. Then came the acceleration. In 18 months, China sold over $200 billion in treasury holdings. The pace was unprecedented. Holdings dropped below $900 billion for the first time since 2010. This was no longer hedging. This was exit. Stage 5. Strategic reallocation. 2023-2024. The pattern shifted again. China stopped simply selling. It started replacing. Yuan-denominated trade agreements with Russia. Oil purchases settled in Chinese currency. Commodity contracts bypassing dollar clearing systems. Each agreement was a brick in an alternative financial architecture. The dollar was being routed around. Stage 6. Currency warfare. 2024 present. The BRICS Summit in Kazan, October 2024. Representatives from Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and dozens of aspiring members gathered to discuss what was once unthinkable: a common settlement currency for non-Western trade. No final agreement was reached, but the intent was unmistakable. The dollar's monopoly on global trade was being openly challenged. Stage 7. The final exit. This stage has not yet been announced, but the preparation is visible to anyone willing to look. Gold reserves climbing. Bilateral currency swaps multiplying. Digital yuan infrastructure expanding. China is not waiting for the dollar to collapse. China is building the system that will replace it. January 2024, the threshold is crossed. China's treasury holdings fall below $800 billion, the lowest level in 15 years. More than $470 billion removed from American debt markets in a single decade. The financial press offers reassurances. China still holds significant reserves. The selling is orderly. There is no panic. They are correct. There is no panic. That is precisely what makes it dangerous. When Argentina's creditors panicked in 2001, the crisis was visible, dramatic, a spectacle of collapsing banks and protesters in the streets. When Greece's creditors panicked in 2010, emergency summits were convened. Bailout packages were assembled. China is not panicking. China is executing. Each stage completed calmly. Each stage according to plan. Each stage bringing Beijing closer to a moment when American debt becomes someone else's problem. The question is no longer whether China will exit completely. The question is what they know about the timing that we do not. There is a number that should terrify every American, and almost no one is talking about it. $34.5 trillion. That is the current national debt of the United States. But the number itself is not the problem. Numbers this large become abstractions, meaningless figures that politicians cite and citizens ignore. The problem is what happens next. In 2024, for the first time in American history, interest payments on the national debt exceeded the entire defense budget. The United States now spends more money servicing its debt than it does funding its military. More than the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and the Marines combined. And interest rates are no longer zero. For over a decade, the Federal Reserve held rates near zero, allowing the government to borrow virtually for free. Those days are over. As rates rose to combat inflation, the cost of servicing existing debt exploded. Each percentage point increase costs hundreds of billions in additional annual payments. The Federal Reserve now faces an impossible choice: lower rates to ease the debt burden, and risk reigniting inflation that devastates the middle class, or maintain higher rates to control prices, and watch debt servicing consume an ever larger share of the federal budget. There is no good option. There is only the choice between different kinds of pain. China understands this arithmetic better than American voters do. They have watched this pattern before, not in America, but in Britain. In 1944, the British pound was still a major reserve currency. The British Empire still circled the globe, but the war had drained the treasury. Britain owed massive debts to the United States, and the Americans were no longer willing to extend favorable terms. What followed was a slow humiliation. The pound was devalued in 1949, then again in 1967. Britain was forced to withdraw from imperial commitments it could no longer afford. Military bases closed, colonies gained independence. By 1971, when Nixon ended gold convertibility, the pound's role as a reserve currency had effectively ended. 27 years. That is how long it took for the pound to fall from global dominance to regional irrelevance. The dollar's decline may be faster. In 1974, the Nixon administration secured an agreement with Saudi Arabia that reshaped global finance. The Saudis would price all oil sales in dollars, and only dollars. In exchange, America would guarantee Saudi security. The petrodollar system was born. For 50 years, this arrangement forced every oil-importing nation to hold dollars. It created permanent demand for American currency. It allowed the United States to run deficits that would have destroyed any other nation. That arrangement is fracturing. In 2023, Saudi Arabia announced it was open to settling oil trades in currencies other than the dollar. Negotiations with China over yuan-denominated sales accelerated. The kingdom that created the petrodollar was publicly contemplating its abandonment. This is what China knows, and what Washington refuses to acknowledge. The structures that sustain dollar dominance are eroding simultaneously. The debt is unsustainable. The petrodollar is weakening. The alternatives are multiplying. De-dollarization is no longer a theory discussed by economists. It is a process being implemented by nations representing over half the world's population. BRICS is not a currency union. Not yet. But it is a coordination mechanism. Brazil settling trade with China in yuan. Russia accepting rupees for oil. India and the UAE conducting transactions in dirhams. Each bilateral agreement weakens the dollar's network effect, and beneath it all, the digital yuan waits. China has spent a decade building a central bank digital currency. Tested domestically, piloted in cross-border transactions, integrated with alternative payment systems. It is not ready to replace the dollar, but it is ready to offer an alternative for nations seeking to escape American financial surveillance and sanctions. What is China hiding? Not a secret, a timeline. They know the dollar's decline is not a matter of if, but when. They know the American political system is incapable of addressing the debt crisis. They know the Federal Reserve has no good options. They are simply positioning themselves to inherit what remains. Every empire believes it is the exception. None ever are. The Romans believed their currency would hold value forever. For centuries, the denarius was the foundation of Mediterranean commerce, trusted from Britain to Babylon. Then the emperors discovered debasement. It began slowly, a little less silver in each coin, a little more copper mixed in. The soldiers still received their pay. The merchants still accepted the coins. The system still functioned, until it didn't. By the reign of Diocletian in the late 3rd century, the denarius had lost 95% of its silver content. Prices exploded. Trade collapsed. The empire that had dominated the known world for 500 years fractured into chaos. It would never fully recover. The Romans did not see it coming. They could not imagine a world without Rome at its center. The Dutch believed their trading empire was invincible. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was the world's dominant financial power. Amsterdam was the global center of capital. The Dutch East India Company was the most valuable corporation in history. The guilder was trusted across continents. Then the wars came. Wars with England, wars with France, wars that drained the treasury faster than trade could fill it. The Dutch borrowed to maintain their empire. They borrowed to fund their navy. They borrowed until the interest payments consumed their prosperity. By 1800, the Dutch Republic was a shadow. The financial center had shifted to London. The empire that had pioneered modern capitalism became a cautionary tale about the limits of debt. The Dutch did not see it coming. They could not imagine Amsterdam losing its primacy. The British believed their empire would last 1,000 years. In 1900, 1/4 of the world's landmass was colored pink on maps, British territory. The pound sterling was the language of global finance. The Royal Navy ruled every ocean. 2 world wars later, Britain was bankrupt. The empire that had seemed eternal dissolved within a single generation. India gone, Africa gone. The Suez humiliation in 1956, the moment we began this story, was merely the punctuation mark on a collapse that had been unfolding for decades. The British did not see it coming. Even as the ships returned home and the flags came down, they believed some form of greatness would endure. What makes Americans believe they will be different? The patterns are not hidden. They are documented in every history book, analyzed in every economics department, visible to anyone willing to look. Empires rise on production and fall on consumption. They rise on savings and fall on debt. They rise on discipline and fall on decadence. The specific details vary. The trajectory does not. America in 2025 is not Rome in 275. It is not Amsterdam in 1780. It is not London in 1945, but it rhymes. A currency debased by endless creation. A debt so large it can never be honestly repaid. A political system incapable of making difficult choices. A population that believes tomorrow will resemble yesterday. And now the creditor is leaving. China's exit from American debt is not an attack. It is a recognition. Beijing has looked at the mathematics of American finance and reached a conclusion. This cannot continue. The only question is how it ends. There are 3 possibilities. First, America could inflate its way out, print enough dollars to make the debt meaningless. This would devastate every saver, every retiree, every person holding dollars. It would be a default by another name, a betrayal of everyone who trusted the currency. Second, America could default explicitly, refuse to pay, restructure the debt. This would trigger a global financial crisis that would make 2008 look like a rehearsal. It would end the dollar's reserve status overnight. Third, America could impose controls, freeze foreign-held assets, restrict capital flows, confiscate wealth in the name of national emergency. History is full of such measures, and they always accelerate the collapse they are meant to prevent. None of these options are good. All of them are becoming more likely. China is not waiting to see which path America chooses. The gold has been accumulated. The alternative systems have been built. The treasury bonds have been sold. The exit is nearly complete. What remains is the aftermath. In 1956, Britain learned what happens when your creditor abandons you. A phone call from Washington ended a military operation and exposed the hollowness of imperial pretension. The British believed they were still a great power. The Suez Crisis proved they were not. America's Suez moment will not arrive as a phone call. It will arrive as an auction, a treasury auction, where there are not enough buyers. It will arrive as a currency crisis, when the world decides it no longer needs dollars. It will arrive quietly at first, then all at once. The lights are going out. Not because China is evil, not because America is virtuous, but because debt has consequences, and empires have lifespans, and no amount of exceptionalism can repeal the mathematics of decline. China is not hiding a secret. China is hiding a countdown. And the clock is almost at 0.